Okay, it's been a minute. Let's see if I can still do this. That's turned off, I think. Is that turned off? Let's double check that. No, it's not. There we go. No more weird noises from that. That's turned off, that's turned off, that's turned off, that's turned on. The stream appears to be live, and I think we're good to go. So let's go ahead and get into it then. Hello! Shadowcat back! It's been a while since I've done a lecture. I managed to keep up with my Sunday streams for a lot, but lectures? I haven't done one of these in... feels like months. I don't know, maybe it has been months. But, I mean, we're here now. We're going to make the best of it. And today, I want to talk a little bit about the fallout from the election. I'm not going to talk about the election itself. There's not a whole lot to really talk about there. It happened, it's over, more or less. I mean, we will kind of get into a little bit of where it's not over yet. But that's a different subject entirely, for the moment being. And this is not going to be a compilation of all the people losing their minds over the election either. If that's what you're looking for, there's plenty of other channels that you can go to who are doing pretty much just that. But it is kind of the core of what I wanted to talk about today, because it's not so much that people are losing their minds over what happened with the election. That was kind of going to be expected regardless of who won. It's the responses to the election and why they're doing it. And more importantly, what they're vowing to do afterwards that I think needs special attention. And so without further ado, I think we should move on. Before we do that though, I look at the chat, I see that JP is in the chat. Hello JP, good to see you. Good to have you back this morning. Let's go ahead and bring up our browser. So, again, we need a place to start from, and that starting place is going to be the election. It happened a couple of weeks ago now, and pretty much the entire world knows what happened at this point. Donald Trump won, Harris lost. We have the electoral map in front of us right here. This is by state, not necessarily by county, although I do find that the county maps are much more interesting to look at. But this is what actually matters because this is how everything was totaled up. And it wasn't even necessarily close. I mean, not on election day at least. It's gotten closer as people have been continuing to count votes. Still though, I mean, there was just no way. Once they called a certain number of states, it was simply awarded. And that began the reaction that we're going to be talking about today. Pop up my chat so I can actually read it easier. There we go. So, the day of the election and the days following the election, and even today, although it has tapered off significantly, there was a very large bump in reactions, and that's kind of leveled out a little bit. There was a great deal of fear, anger, rage, just hyperbolic emotions all over the place. Jeffrey's in the chat this morning. Hello, Jeffrey. Good to see you. There were people that were trying to explain why it was that Trump won, especially since all the polls really put him at kind of losing. Although polls are subjective, I've found it best. The rhetoric around Trump said that he couldn't win. The accusations around Trump said that he couldn't win. He was demonized by the media. He's been convicted by the courts. Everything said that he couldn't. Not to mention everything that was said about what would happen if he actually did take power again. Donald Trump has been called literally the next incarnation of Hitler, which makes all of his followers Nazis, and we know what happened the last time they had power in the world. So nobody was prepared for him winning. Nobody believed it was possible that he could win. And so when it did happen, everyone had to ask how he won in the first place. And before we get to how he won in the first place, well, let's just look at what they think happened. So the first thing to happen was everyone had to point fingers, because that's just what you do. And interestingly enough, one of the first people to get get fingers pointed at them was Biden. Biden was actually blamed for Harris losing, even though Biden was not even in the race. But they still say it's his fault. Biden didn't give her the appropriate support. Biden poisoned the well. Biden was actually working against her. Biden had secretly set up the entire election for her to lose. Biden is the one that did everything. And so Harris couldn't have lost on her own. She actually had to be cut down from her own party so that Trump could be installed as the new president-elect. How much credence you want to put into that, I don't know. I've heard the stories, I don't believe it for a minute, but I do think that there's a lot of coincidences in there that just don't make sense. They also say that perhaps Biden was trying to get revenge after being told that he wasn't allowed to run for the presidency. There was talk that he was trying to get revenge after Harris was installed without the democratic process. We'll never know. We can never know. But they're pointing the blame game there anyway. However, if it wasn't Biden that did it, then it had to have been the people that did it. And so we have to look at the actual people. If black men didn't vote for Harris, then the black men were the problem. If white men didn't vote for Harris, then white men were the problem. If white women didn't vote for Harris, then white women were the problem. And so on and so forth. Basically, there was a smear campaign that ran nationwide, and it covered the entire population. If you didn't vote for Harris, then you were simply a problem. You were a traitor to your own particular group. So if you were a woman and you voted for Trump, then you were acting against other women. If you were black and you voted for Trump, you were against other blacks. It didn't matter who you were, actually, because the term, the group, was completely interchangeable. It was a Mad Lib. Just insert whichever group that you wanted and fill in both fields with the same group. So everything was racial, or it was gendered, or it was orientation, it was religion. Didn't actually matter, which is one of the reasons why a lot of their campaign messaging seemed to ring so hollow. Because it essentially was. They came up with a single blank slate that they could apply to whatever they needed to. It was a template, not a platform. And so, with every single person being told that you're a bad person if you do not vote for our particular candidate, and practically nothing else, many people were turned off by it. However, it didn't stop them from pointing the finger to begin with. And if it wasn't due to Biden, and it wasn't due to people, it was due to fear. Because a large amount, and I've discussed this at length, a large amount of this election was based off of fear. Now, this did not exclusively go one way. This went both ways. If you were a Republican and you were listening to talk about the Democrats and their plans to take power, you would have been told that the Democrats had the vision to reconstruct the country into a new kind of Soviet United States. Because they wanted to do things like deconstruct the Constitution, because the Constitution was an outdated document. They needed to re-educate people who voted for Trump because these people needed to be fixed. We needed to deal with the political dissidents that were holding the country back. These are all things that we have seen before in places like the Soviet Union and Maoist China, and it's things that they openly discuss doing. Now, discussing doesn't mean actually doing them, but in terms of optics, as JP said, yeah, it's bad optics. Now, if you're a Democrat and you're listening to what they were saying about the Republicans, it's quite the opposite. We're going complete horseshoe theory on this one, from the communist side all the way around to the fascist side. Although that word may be ill applied in the situation, but either way, they said the Republicans were going to start the Fourth Reich. They were going to be rounding people up into camps, and they were going to be stripping away rights from entire groups of people. First the women, then the Hispanics, then the blacks, until only the superior race would rule and exist in the United States at all. There was fear-mongering that went on in both directions. And of course, in the spirit of one-upsmanship, it just had to get more extreme every time until eventually people stopped paying attention. At least the majority of people stopped paying attention. Eventually they realized that no, Trump is not actually going to be Hitler. And his followers are not actually the Nazis. And Harris was not going to be the new Stalin. And all the Democrats were not going to become the new... I don't necessarily know what the name was for Stalin's followers. The new communists? I'm not sure. Once you got past the fear-mongering, people realized that there was just nothing there. And so it came down to a matter of policies, and as they continued to try and fear-monger on both sides, it just didn't work. So the Democrats started by pointing the finger at Biden. They then continued by pointing the finger at the people. And then, when that didn't work, they pointed the finger at their opposition. That didn't work. And so they continued to point fingers at literally any direction, every single other person, place, thing, idea, everything. But they never ever once pointed the finger at themselves. And thus we have the current state of politics in the United States when it comes to the Democrats, the progressives, and the post-election reaction. I briefly want to go back and revisit a lecture that I did a long time ago, where I talked about the leftist religion in the United States, and I broke it down considerably, where I actually compared a recognized cult from history. In the case of the live stream, I talked about the Jonestown cult. We talked about religions in general, and I used the Abrahamic religions as well as Hinduism. I also talked about the organized religions, because you can be a part of a religion and not be a part of the organized religion. My examples given, and you can see them here, would be things like just Christianity in general versus the Catholic Church. But we discussed it at length because many people like to call the left a cult. And I pushed back on that one hard, and I said calling them a cult is disingenuous at best. It's inappropriate, and we shouldn't do that. The left are not a cult. They are far larger than that. They are far more organized than that. They are far more structured than that. The left is a religion. And so I broke it down, and I proved that we can treat them as such. And now we can look at the election not through a necessary political lens, but I want to look at this as more of a religious lens. Let's strike the idea of them being political parties from the discussion at the moment, and let's look at things in a different way. What if instead of believing that we had two political parties, what if we instead approach this from the idea of there being two religious ideologies that were on the election today? For the Democrats, it was the progressive religion, which we have discussed at length. It is a religion that believes in equality above all things. It believes in racial identities. It believes in intersectionality. It believes in all of these things that need to be addressed. However, it also is a religion that does not tolerate dissension. It does not tolerate outside ideas. It is a rather intolerant religion when it comes to anything that does not fit what they want or what they preach. And those who do stray from the dogma of the progressives are often excommunicated, usually socially, sometimes physically, and occasionally violently. That is not to say that the other side does not also display elements of this. When we look at the conservative side, they do hold up the Constitution as a sacred document. And in a way, it actually is. Now, that was never the intention of it, but that is the way it is treated. The Constitution is immutable. It is unquestionable, more or less. There are some times when things have been questioned in it, and sometimes amendments have been made to it. However, those amendments have been made to the Constitution in the same way books have been added to the Bible. In other words, it hasn't actually changed what the Bible is or what the Bible says. They are just simply added on to the end to offer further insights. There is certainly a respective hierarchy, a considerably greater respective hierarchy in the conservative side than you see in the progressive side. And so it would not go completely unopposed that you could call the conservative side just as much of a religion as you could the progressives. Which is why I have always said that the current conflict in the United States has never been a political one for the last 20 to 30 years. It has been one of religious ideals, because they don't really bend, they do not really compromise. Now, you will see a little bit more compromise on the conservative side. It's one of the reasons why people have been going that direction in the last decade or so to a great deal. And this is not exactly unprecedented. One of the things that made Christianity very appealing as it spread across the world was its compromising nature. There were some things that did not or could not be compromised. God as the single supreme being, Christ as the Savior, Moses as the prophet. These things could not be changed. But many of the actual doctrines and dogmas could be bent to fit a culture that it wanted to fit into. It was willing to mesh itself in with the current culture, to grow and change in order to be accepted. Whereas many other religions, I'll use Islam as an example, are completely immutable, and either you follow them or buy its own doctrine. If it cannot be spread by the word, it shall be spread by the sword. It's in that way that we find that Islam and progressivism do share a fair amount in common. And it's here where I think that we really need to discuss the reaction. So, I didn't pull up the quote because it's not really important to this, but it's misattributed to Einstein that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result. Einstein never actually said that, but it is a very good quote and most people recognize it. Because it is a rather simple way of putting it. If you keep doing the same process and you keep failing again and again, you're doing something wrong. You're misunderstanding something. You're not being insightful enough. You're not being reflective enough. And you need to change. This is where I believe we find the progressives following the election. The Democrats lost. Progressivism lost. And when I say progressivism lost, that was really the crux of it. The Democratic Party doesn't really have much of a platform at the moment, except for resist. That was pretty much their entire thing back in 2020, and it was partially their platform back in 2016. It's not so much that they had a platform of ideas, that they had policies they wanted to push forward, although they did have some of those every time, but the bulk of their campaign was centered on this idea that it's not that you need to vote for us. It's that we need you to not vote for the other side. And thus, we have the recent election in the US. The Harris campaign took, I believe it was about 2 months to actually put up any kind of platform on their website. For those 2 months, literally the only thing they had to go on was opposition. They actually have a word for it. They call it opposition politics, where you don't stand for anything, you only stand against something else. It's universally recognized as a very weak platform to stand on, and it usually fails almost every time it's used. When they did finally put up a platform to run on, it was a somewhat weak platform. It was more or less just the same platform that they used in 2020, just continued. And that wasn't probably the greatest move either, given that in the last 4 years, most people had disagreed with the direction the country was going to begin with. And with both of those failing, the only thing they had left to do was to point fingers. Now, we just discussed that. They pointed fingers at everyone after the election, but they were doing that before the election. They told men that if you do not vote for Harris, that you are a misogynist. They told blacks that if you don't vote for Harris, you're a white supremacist. Which most people found hilarious, that black people would be the white supremacists. But then they also told white people, if you don't vote for Harris, you're a white supremacist. So everybody was a white supremacist if they didn't vote for Harris before the election. Whether you were white, black, Hispanic, Asian, didn't matter. If you didn't vote for Harris, you were that group. If you were gay or trans or anyone under the LGBTQ umbrella and you didn't vote for Harris, well, you're just signing up for essentially your own pink triangle. And that's what you're threatening to do to everybody else. If you're not familiar, the pink triangle was a symbol from Nazi Germany that identified gays for extermination. So, that was their campaign before the election, and as we just covered, that was also their campaign after the election, which is what brings me back to the idea of doing the same thing and expecting a different result being the definition of insanity. They have done nothing. They have changed nothing. And this is where I think we have to come back to the idea of religion being, or the progressives being a religion. If we go back in history, we can look at the Christian Reformation. Now, the story of the Christian Reformation is a little bit exaggerated, but it's still a really good story, and so we'll keep the exaggerated version. The idea that the Catholic Church, under the Pope, had gotten into the business practice of selling off indulgences so that people could sin at will. And if you were wealthy enough, you could literally just buy your way into heaven. This was business practice as normal for the longest time, until a man named Martin Luther felt that he could no longer go along with this. Martin Luther was an extremely devoted, extremely pious Christian. He worked in the monastery. He was so extreme, actually, that even some of the other monks in the monastery were a little concerned about him. It's a fun story. You should go look it up. The point is, though, that he looked at what the church was doing. He looked at Scripture, and he said, we are not even living up to our own standards, okay? The way we behave, the way we act, is not in line with what we tell other people to do. And so, he actually made his protest against the Catholic Church, which involved nailing his grievances to the door, which didn't actually happen, but it's a wonderful image. And he led the schism within Christianity. This was where you had, the group split. You had the Catholic Church, and then you had the Protestants. Note the word protest in Protestant. It's where they got the name from. I don't think they actually even adopted that name. I think they were just branded as the Protestants, and they wore that as a badge. But it took a certain level of introspection. It took a certain level of... well, it took bravery, honestly. And the willingness to admit that he, as a follower of the Catholic Church, could have been wrong. To stand up and say, we can't do this anymore. And so the schism happened. Now, whether that was a good thing or a bad thing remains debated by scholars even today. After all, when you look at Christianity now, there are more than 100 different denominations of Christianity. Now, there's some that are bigger, some that are smaller, but the fact that they are different denominations entirely, and that they disagree on the core tenets of Christianity, that does say something about what happened with the schism. The reason I bring this up, though, is because the Catholic Church would have been content to go on doing the same thing over and over again, and they were quite content to do so. They were actually becoming very wealthy from it. The progressives in the United States and in Western culture in general also find themselves in a similar position. They have been operating their religious doctrine across the Western nations for decades now. And they have been very successful in doing so, not without setback, but they have been successful. However, in 2016, they lost. And they didn't accept that they lost when it happened. They again pointed fingers at everybody else and said, it's everyone else's fault but ours that we lost the 2016 US election. And they ran on that for the next 4 years, until 2020 came around. Now, the results of 2020 are still hotly debated today, and after the last election, they remain hotly debated, especially since the 2024 election fell somewhere in the area of, I think it's currently sitting about 10 million votes short of the 2020 election. And nobody can adequately explain where those votes have gone. Because we didn't lose 10 million people in 4 years. That didn't happen. So, they did win in 2020. How they won is still up for debate. And then in 2024, without those extra 10 million votes, they lost again. And they lost harder. The election has ended not just with Trump getting elected, but the conservatives have also taken the House of Representatives and the Senate, and, depending on who you ask, they also currently control the Supreme Court. Depending on how you want to look at the results, it looks like complete conservative domination and that the progressives have been completely routed. Normally, this should be an opportunity for the losing party to be introspective. They should ask themselves, how did we lose, and how did we lose so badly? What did they do wrong? However, as we found out, that has not actually been the case. Much like the Catholic Church, when Martin Luther made his protest, they pointed at Martin Luther, and they pointed at people like him and said that you are the problem. Martin Luther was branded everything short of a heretic, which of course, being a heretic would have probably come with a death sentence during that time. But he was told that he was being blasphemous. He was told that he was going against the church and therefore against the will of God. And he was told that he was the problem. Very similar to how we see the progressives in the United States right now pointing to everyone else and saying they are the problem. Biden is the problem. Whites are the problem. Gays are the problem. Women are the problem. Everybody else is the problem and the reason why they lost. And so what we find out is that when a religious person or group is confronted with the idea that perhaps their views and their practices were wrong, one of the hallmarks of faith is that it is often rigid and incapable of adapting. Typically, what we see in religion is that when you fail, it is generally the fault that you did not do what you were doing hard enough. If you happen to be a person of faith, you didn't pray hard enough. If you are a person of philosophy, you didn't meditate hard enough. Or you didn't meditate on the right things. Or, in the case of modern progressivism, if you are an activist, you weren't an activist hard enough. You didn't go to enough people, you didn't convince enough people. Whatever the problem is, you didn't do it hard enough. And so we see that the response after the election has largely been the same as the response prior to the election. The only difference is that after the election, they have decided to double down and do it more. If men were the problem before, now men are not just the problem, men need to be punished. If blacks were the problem before, now they're still the problem and they have to be punished. If gays were the problem before, they still are, and now they need to be punished. There is no introspection. There's no reflection that maybe what they did wrong in the first, or what they were doing in the first place was wrong. It's just that they didn't do it quite hard enough. And we've seen that anybody who questions that, again, much as Martin Luther, has been branded as an apostate to the progressives, and they have been resoundingly excommunicated. So where does that leave us now? Well, we've seen a lot of people talking over the last couple of weeks about what do we do now, where do we go forward? And what has the answer been? Well, as Trump has been assembling the people for his cabinet. We have actually seen the same thing on the other side. This is the current talking point from many of the Democrats in Congress, because when it comes to building his cabinet, Trump has to put all of his candidates in front of Congress and have them approved by Congress. Their current plan, however, is to simply appoint their own people, to ignore what Trump wants, and install their own people, to have their own Secretary of Defense, their own Secretary of Education, their own Secretary of Health and Human Services, and so on and so forth. In other words, they're not going to learn from what happened in the election. They're simply going to use force now. Again, a religion that is not spread by the word, then spread by the sword. So, when the day comes, the plan they currently have, and there are ways around this of course, but the plan they currently have is to simply deny all of Trump's nominations for the cabinet and install their own. This way they can wrest control away from Trump and they can maintain control over the entire government, and they can go through and continue to purge. If they cannot remove Trump himself from the office, they can at least remove all of his other people. And that can go far down. They can start with the cabinet. However, they can also do this to any of his appointees into other agencies and institutions. And they can even go through and do this to the general public. After all, the January 6th protesters are still being held in prison without charge or trial for what in many cases has amounted to simple trespassing. They do not care about the laws. They do not care about the procedures. They simply believe in power, and that's it. Now, that appeal to power is part of why they lost in the first place, because as people were fear-mongering, saying that, if we let them win, they're going to wield power and they're going to use it against you, this is actually lending credence to that. This idea that if we cannot win legitimately, then we will take what we want. Again, we see the incapability of reflecting upon our actions and then correcting our courses. And so this is just going to continue. If this succeeds, it will undermine the US government as a whole. They're not thinking that far ahead, but if this succeeds, it will essentially remove the legitimacy of the cabinet itself. The cabinet will simply become a vessel to hold power, but it will no longer command any kind of respect or authority. But that's not under consideration right now, because all that is under consideration at the moment is simply taking the power that is desired. Similarly, across the rest of the United States, we are seeing a coalition of states who are promising to create a governor-level alliance. And what did they call it? I forget. Right, here we go. The Governors Safeguarding Democracy, or GSD. Which they say will leverage the collective strength, experience, and institutional knowledge in governors' offices across the country to craft laws and policies that protect the rule of law and serve the people of our great states, according to their website. Now, that is a wonderful statement to make, and at its face value, it sounds like there's nothing wrong with that. However, they're safeguarding democracy. Now, in order to safeguard something, you would first have to believe that it's under threat. So if it's under threat, we then have to ask who is the one threatening it. Of course, the answer to this is President-elect Donald Trump. So, if President-elect Donald Trump is the one who is threatening democracy, and they're going to safeguard it, that essentially means, using just basic logic, that the intention is to create a coalition of governors to oppose any laws sent down by the President Trump when he actually takes office. This is, by any other definition, sedition. Again, rather than look inward and try to ask why did the Democrats lose the election, instead, the first action taken is to point fingers and then to wield the sword. There will be no introspection, there will be no questions asked. Instead, it will be the exercise of naked power. Now, you could tell me right now that this is simply my interpretation of it, and perhaps my interpretation is wrong. However, currently in the state of Pennsylvania, the ballot counting is going on, which is why I said at the beginning that the election is technically continuing. And that's why I wasn't going to get into it there, because I'm going to get into it here. The state of Pennsylvania has already been called. The state was called for Trump. The Senate seat was called for, I think his name is McCormick. And the representative seats have already been called. And there's a lot of them, so I'm not going to get into all those. All of them have technically already been called. However, the state of Pennsylvania is continuing to count ballots. Now, this is actually being done in the face of the Fifth Circuit Supreme Court ruling prior to the election, which said that we do have an election day. And while early ballots are not explicitly unconstitutional, there has to be an end point. The election day is that end point, and so continuing to count ballots after election day is unlawful, and any ballots counted are illegitimate. This, however, has not stopped the state of Pennsylvania from doing so. And as a matter of fact, in Bucks County, they even had a discussion on this. I don't normally play videos, and I hope this is going to be audible, but let's find out. It's a whole 30 seconds long.
We reject all three categories of these ballots.
Your motion is to reject or dismiss the challenges in this category in front of you?
Correct, yep.
Not going to second that, mostly because I think we all know that precedent by a court doesn't matter anymore in this country, and people violate laws anytime they want. So for me, if I violate this law, it's because I want a court to pay attention to it.
We reject all.
Okay. And so it's kind of like right there, it's admitted. This has actually been a talking point for a long time. This is actually one that has been brought up multiple times as Donald Trump has been dragged through the courts at both the state and the federal level. Many of the cases that Trump has been drawn into either did not have any kind of precedent, or they actually had precedent in his favor. For example, when Trump was being held up on charges of election interference over the January 6th incident. Well, no president has ever been charged with something like that before, and he didn't have any direct influence on it. By any other metric, he should not have been charged at all, but they did anyway. And in cases such as the one in New York, Trump was charged or went through 2 cases in New York, the first of which was the sexual assault case. That case actually had to have new laws written in retroactively because the statute of limitations had been so far past that under normal circumstances it would never have been accepted. In addition, the case had an extremely low amount of evidence. There was no security camera footage from back that far. There was DNA evidence offered, however, the prosecution opted not to do a DNA test, either because they knew that it wouldn't match or because they knew that it would be inconclusive and that wouldn't help them. So the only real evidence that was presented in that case was testimony, and testimony is generally not enough to convict on, but they convicted anyway. So is true with the hush money case, where he was accused of election interference by paying off his lawyer to essentially make the entire Stormy Daniels thing go away. Now, under normal circumstances, that would not be a crime. They tried to brand it as election interference, even though that's never been done before, and even then, that would have been a minor charge as well. So instead, they charged every payment to his lawyer as a misdemeanor in furtherance of another crime. Which, while it can be done, each one of them would be a misdemeanor. They said that because it was in addition to election interference, which is a felony, that every one of the preceding misdemeanors would also be a felony, and so they charged Trump with somewhere in the area of 34 felonies. In addition to all of that, during the jury deliberation, in the jury instructions, it was given to the jury that they need not actually come to a consensus on any of the charges. If they could find, or if anyone could find guilt in his charges, then he could be convicted of those charges, and so a unanimous jury was no longer needed either. This again is completely unprecedented in law. This has never happened before in any court at any level. The jury is supposed to bring back a unanimous vote. Period. But in this case, not needed. So we already have precedent that we're ignoring precedent. So when we finally hear it actually admitted in a formal setting, most people are not even surprised. And what we get from this is the fact that even the people that are currently in power recognize that the law no longer matters, and that if they do not win by legal means, there is always illegal means of attaining power. And that is through the exercise of further power. Now, right now, we're talking about legal power. To simply say, I am a person of authority, and I decree that this happens. However, this is not to say that they could not exercise other power. Much like we saw that we have governors who are assembling a coalition to resist the presidency. Every single one of these states could also activate their own National Guard. Every state has essentially a standing army. The National Guard that resides in their state can be activated at any time and directed as the state desires. That is a kinetic force that they have the ability to use. Will they use it? I don't know. And so we can see this inflexibility, this inability to look inwards and say, did we do something wrong? The answer to that, of course, is no. They think that they did absolutely nothing wrong. The only mistake that they made is they didn't go far enough. They didn't go hard enough. And that the only real solution is to go harder. And so they do. However, this is not restricted to simply the people in power. It's not just the governors, it's not just the judges and the representatives. Even on the ground. This has been what a lot of the rage video, or I guess you could call them the rage videos, have been. It has been the left deciding to punish anybody in their lives who have done wrong. I picked this one just because I find it to be amusing. However, it's not restricted to simply women and sex. Although that's been a big one. You've seen videos, you've read articles of women who have been saying, we're joining the 4B movement. If you're not familiar with the 4B movement, it essentially comes down to no dating, no marriage, no sex, and no having children. Period. With any man, ever. There are even some cases of women who are going out and getting themselves sterilized because they simply do not want to be a part of any of this anymore. And they're going to do this in order to punish men, supposedly. However, it's not explicit just to, men. There are some men who are cutting off their wives or their girlfriends, saying that I'm not going to do anything with you. Not nearly as many, but it has happened. What I think is actually more interesting, though, is we had a psychiatrist from Yale who came out and said that it is essential to cut off your family. Now, one of the reasons why so many people call the progressives a cult is for this reason explicitly. It's not just that they hold ideological doctrines that they stick to specifically, and that they do not tolerate anybody straying from them. It's that the response to anybody who is not a part of their religion is to excommunicate them. In this case, it is literally to say it doesn't matter if you are a friend, it does not matter if you are a family. If they do not follow the same doctrines as you, they must be removed from your life. This is, and I do believe that I can see it up here, it's hard to kind of read it because it's very small. I don't know if I can really blow this up or not. Can I? Oh, no, I don't think I can. Nope, I can't actually make the video any bigger. But we can see up here, under the cult, let me back up the video a little bit. Nope, back a little bit further. There we go. Okay, if I can read this. So, devotion to a charismatic leader. They don't really have a single leader. Although, if you wanted to call Harris the leader, I guess, kinda. Emphasis on group cohesion and loyalty. Obviously, as I've explained in detail, you are either one of us or you're not one of us. And if you are, there is no deviation. Separation from mainstream society and beliefs. No, they exist in mainstream society. As a matter of fact, they control large parts of mainstream society. Unorthodox or non-traditional beliefs and practices. We can see that after the last election, with the majority of the popular vote going to Trump, that they are not the overwhelming majority anymore. And maybe they never were. It is very likely that the progressive religion has always been rather niche. They have a lot of supporters, don't get me wrong, but they have never been the dominant ideology. High degree of control over members, though. This is exactly what we are talking about right now. If you are a progressive, if you were a Harris voter, you need to cut off your family if they voted for Trump. If your boyfriend voted for Trump, you need to cut him off. Join the 4B movement if you need to. If you have friends, they're not your friends anymore. If you went to, I don't know, let's say a card shop, and that card shop ever, say, put up a little, handheld Trump flag, you stop going to that card shop. Anything that is associated with Trump is poison, and you cut poison out. And that's what we're seeing right now, that they are telling people, if your family voted for Trump, you get rid of them. They are encouraging people to end their marriages and divorce their spouses if their spouse voted for Trump. Okay? Take the kids, take the house, take the car, take whatever it is, but either way, that person needs to be gone. Again, we see the reaction. It's not about reflection, it's not about introspection. At no point do you ask, what did we do wrong? Because according to the religion, you did nothing wrong. According to doctrine, you did everything right. And it's their fault. Those people's fault. And this is why we are seeing the current meltdown, because what we're actually observing right now is a crisis of faith for, and if we go back to look at this, for, 73.5 million people. Okay, that's not true. But for a large number of people, their faith has been tested and they have failed. Every single one of those people came out and they did what they were supposed to do. They prayed at the ballot box. They preached from the street corner. They did everything that, and I know that they don't have a God, but you'll understand what I'm saying here. They did everything that God told them to do. And they lost. And they don't know how to handle that. And why would they know how to handle that? This has been something that has plagued religions since religion was a thing. We can go back and we can look at even ancient civilizations who, would sacrifice people and animals to the sun just to make sure that the sun would come out again. Because if anything was to happen, if the grain harvest was to fail that year, it's because God was angry at them. If the winter passed but the rivers did not refill because there wasn't enough snow, it's because they did something wrong and God was angry at them and they needed to do more. And so what was more? More was usually sacrifice. Sacrifice your food, sacrifice your shelter, sacrifice your people, sacrifice your animals. You sacrifice to get more. Or you simply take from somebody else. But that's the response when a religion is tested. And that's what we see now. So the question going forward now is, what's going to happen in the future? As we've seen with Christianity, when Christianity was tested, it split. And when it split, it actually kind of solved a lot of their problems. The Catholic Church eventually did reform. The Reformation happened because eventually they were forced to admit that, yeah, a lot of things that the Catholic Church was doing were bad. Selling indulgences was bad. Allowing, people to simply buy their way into heaven, that was a bad thing. They made mistakes. Turns out that even, the people of God are still people. And so, forgiveness. However, they reformed. And you ended up with a Reformed Catholic Church. You ended up with the Protestants. And of course, they split again. Actually, no, it might have been the Lutherans. It was the Lutherans when the schism happened, and not the Protestants. I'm not even sure anymore now. But you ended up with the Lutherans and the Protestants, and they continued to split off and bud. And that turned Christianity into the largest religion in the world. Islam is a close second, but Christianity still has them beat. They had to reform. They had to fix themselves. The question we have to ask now is, when it comes to the progressives in the US, will they reform? And I've heard some people say that they need, or that they will. However, it's a skeptical they will. A lot of people don't believe it's possible. After all, if the progressive religion was to reform itself, it would inherently lose some of itself. Because it would have to cede some ground to essentially what their opposition holds. They would need to start making compromises. And I don't know if they're capable of making compromises. At least not at this point in time. We may see the beginning of a reform. I don't know. Especially going into 2028 now. They're already talking about how they need to find a more middle-of-the-road and a more charismatic candidate to run, before they can really do anything. They're going to need to start making changes to the words they use, the groups they target, or the fact that they're even targeting groups at all. Where was it? This is not going to work anymore. It's just not. They cannot continue to come out and tell the people that everything is going to end. I've had this conversation before in regards to other things. As I've stated before, when I was younger, and I mean, I'm not old, but I'm decently old, but when I was younger, I was told that within 5 years, if we did not change course, that the rainforests were going to be gone. 5 years after that, I was told that if we didn't change course, the rainforests were going to be gone. Well, number one, not only were the rainforests not gone, but as it stands today, there is more rainforest in the world than there was 50 years ago. We have done a fantastic job of tending to the rainforests. Part of that is due to the activism, not gonna lie. However, it's also just due to the fact that we take care of things. Currently, right now, we're being told that if we don't end fossil fuels, the world is going to end. Notable was Greta Thunberg, who came out and said if we do not stop all fossil fuels today, that the world in 10 years is going to be unlivable. Well, she said that 10 years ago. We're all still here. The fear-mongering is going to have to stop. People, as a whole, are not nearly as stupid as the people in charge think they are. We all know that the world was here for millions of years before we were here. And it will be here for millions of years after we're gone. So trying to convince people that the world is going to end is not going to work. Trying to convince people that we're going to be creating the new Aryan race and laying the foundation for the new American empire is not going to work. If America was going to be an empire, it would have done so a long time ago. Now, this is also true in the other direction. The United States is not going to become the new United Soviet States of America either. Even though I do find the idea of the USSA kind of funny, especially as we can then have conversations about the USSR and the USSA. But that's just, my morbid humor. It's not going to happen, though. And so any campaign that is going to be based off of fear is not going to fly. And right now, that's a lot of what they have. All they have is the fear-mongering. If you don't vote for us, women's rights are over. If you don't vote for us, black rights are over. The Civil Rights Amendment and the Civil Rights Act are going to be repealed. The funny thing about that is, the Civil Rights Act has already been discussed for being repealed. And the place that discussed repealing it was California. The reason for it is because California said that the Civil Rights Act actually gets in the way. They want to be able to discriminate. They want to be able to discriminate specifically against whites, because they feel that affirmative action doesn't go far enough. And so you had the most progressive state in the country being the first one to suggest repealing the Civil Rights Act. It's not going to work anymore. JP says politics and morals are more pendulum-based. Rules change back and forth and social progress happens in a slow incremental pace. I propose the progressive movement went too fast, society wasn't ready. I disagree with that. And the reason I disagree with that is because you have to look at what they were actually proposing. When it came to things like rights, I do think that there is a case there. I mean, the fight for civil rights was a very slow one. It was slow, it was methodical, there was a lot of pushback, but eventually it did happen. And the United States has always been very progressive when it comes to giving rights to people. However, the platform that was run on during this election was not so much one about necessarily social progress. The biggest problem they had when it came to that was things like trans issues. Now, the Democrats ran on the platform that the Republicans, if they ever got into power, were going to erase trans people from existence. Well, obviously, that is not going to happen. They didn't erase the gays from existence. They didn't erase the lesbians from existence. They're not going to erase the trans people from existence either. However, it's not so much that society wasn't ready for it. It's that society outright rejects what they're proposing. When it came to the trans issue, trans people have existed forever. There has never been a time in human history where trans people were not a thing. However, up until roughly 16 or so years ago, I would say, trans people, we called them transsexuals back then, or transvestites, depending on whether you were pre-op or post-op. They had a very simple goal. The interesting part of this is that in order to be trans, you have to identify as something to transition into. And so the very existence of trans people really supports the whole gender binary that they're trying to push against. Regardless, though, the point of being trans was to pass. The most successful moment in any trans person's life is the first time that they can go out into public as their preferred and ideal sex, and for nobody to ever question them. For people to assume their gender just by looking at them, and for everybody around them to treat them as the gender they represent. This was the holy grail for every single trans person in existence. If you were a male to female, it was to feminize yourself, to put on the airs of being female, and to really just embody that, and for people to see that when they look at you. If you are a female to male, it was the opposite, for people to look at you and assume that you are a man, and to treat you like they would treat any other man. This has existed forever. And the reason you know that it has existed forever is because you can go through history and you can find the stories of people who lived that life. You can always find stories of, there's that one, maybe that weird neighbor down the street who, dresses up as a woman. And yeah, I mean, we find it a little bit weird, however we accept it, and then just watch as the stories progress until eventually that person is accepted as simply living as a woman and no one knows the difference. The trans people will tell you that every single one of those stories ends with that person being lynched. However, that has never happened in history. Ever. Anywhere. It just doesn't. Well, okay, I can't say anywhere in the world because the Islamic states exist. But the point is that in the US at least, this is not new. And it has never really, it's never been criminalized. It's been treated as weird. It's been treated as strange. But it's never been stopped. And the minute those people can actually pass, it is the greatest day in their lives. Society is actually ready for that, and has been for a long time. What society is not ready for, and will never be ready for, was the idea of 67 genders. Society was not ready, and will never be ready for, this idea of an innumerable number of sexual orientations. Society is not ready for the idea of drag queens walking around in their daily lives. It's a fun thing at parties. It's a fun thing down at the club. However, time and a place. And society is not going to accept that. Not now and not ever. It's not that they went too fast. It's that they went too far. Because we've gone way past the ideas of simple, acceptance. We are now demanding that people change their entire worldviews and accept things that literally do not make any kind of grounded sense. And when they push too hard, this was the result. This is why they have alienated the gays. Because even the gays and the lesbians are looking at the platform and saying, "You're kicking me out. I don't have a place here anymore." It's why so many women are looking at it and saying, "I wanted freedom. I had freedom. The Civil Rights Act, the 19th Amendment, all of these things granted me freedom, and now you're telling me what I have to do." They didn't go too fast. They simply went too far. The question now is, can they recognize that and can they dial it back? And for my personal opinion, I don't think they can. I think that the religion is right now just too focused on spreading itself and conquering. And so even if they do find themselves in a more moderate position now, for say this next election, if they lose, and I suppose I should have mentioned this before, they lost. And the response to them losing was to be more fervent and more zealous. This is a hallmark of religions. If they lose the next election, their response is going to be they weren't fervent enough. They were not zealous enough, and they have to be more fervent and zealous. If they win in 2026 and 2028, it will be the confirmation that everything they're doing is right, and they will become more fervent and more zealous. You can see how it only can go in one direction, which is why they need reformation. And if they cannot reform, I suspect they're going to end up exactly like the Catholic Church probably would have. They would have grown in power, and then they would have been consumed by it. The Catholic Church before the Reformation was not in a good place. It was largely recognized as being corrupt by every single nation in Europe. Their authority and their respect was waning. The kings that were anointed by the Pope and blessed had lost respect because of the Pope's blessing. It's where we find ourselves right now, where everything that is endorsed by the progressive religion is not taken seriously. We look at all these progressive businesses when they have an opinion on something, and the popular meme on the internet is Silence Brand. I don't know if they can change it, and I don't know how they change it, but this is where they stand. Post this election, their response has simply been more zeal. And it's not going to save them. And if they continue on this path, they may just lose in 26. They may just lose in 28. If they continue in this path, we may not even have an election. When we look at the governorships banding together, can you imagine a world where they simply decide that there's enough of them and they no longer need to respect the federal government? Perhaps they have enough common landmass amongst them that they simply say, we secede. We will put up checkpoints at our borders. We will ignore the federal laws. We will operate under our own laws, draw up our own constitution. It's a bit of a far-fetched idea. However, where we stand, it is not an impossible one. In the 2016 election, there was talk of secession. In the 2020 election, there was actually a compact drawn up among the Pacific states, where if Trump was to win, they would secede. And now, we see the coalition of governors, the governors safeguarding democracy. Well, I'm reminded of a line from the movie The Lord of War. Every African warlord brands themselves as a freedom fighter. They're a liberator. They're a president. Their words. Every African warlord is a warlord. And so they can call themselves the governors safeguarding democracy, but really, it's a seditious plot. It's always been a seditious plot. They have always been the same people they are now. If they can stop and reflect, maybe things change. If not, then we just continue along this path to wherever it leads. I don't know the answer. I don't know where that ends. But I did think that it was worth talking about the response to the election and how it just goes to show that the progressive religion is still alive and strong, and it is still every bit the religion that I said it was. This is just concrete. So, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to wrap things up here. I want to thank everybody who came out for this one. It's been a while since I've done a lecture, but it felt good to get that off. If you're not familiar with the channel, I don't necessarily do these lectures every week, but I'm going to try to get them done more often now, especially now that I'm not traveling anymore. If you're a regular of the channel and you enjoy the tabletop streams, we will be starting Magic the Gathering on Sunday, tomorrow. So if you want to come for that, that's great. Otherwise, though, if you just like what's on this channel, you want to see more of it, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, that way you get notified every time that these videos come out. If you know somebody else who's also kind of going over the fallout from the 2024 election and questioning why the reaction, I don't see many people asking the question of why these days, but just in case, share this video with them. They might get something out of it. Otherwise, though, if you just like me and you like what I'm doing, leave a like on the video. If you want to leave a comment down below, you can do that. There's also a link down below to the Discord server. So if you want to continue this conversation there, simply join us on the Discord and we can do that. Otherwise, though, I will see you either later in the week for the normal videos, maybe tomorrow for the stream, maybe for the next lecture. Either way, though, until I see you again, take care.